early 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The winter air was sharp and thin as a silver P-51 Mustang rolled to the edge of the runway. Inside the cockpit, a test pilot adjusted his oxygen mask and placed a steady hand on the throttle. Below, a team of engineers stood behind reinforced glass, eyes locked on the instruments, hearts pounding with quiet anticipation. This was no ordinary test flight. Today, they would push the Mustang and its Merlin engine beyond every known limit. The propeller spun into a blur. The engine roared, deeper and stronger than usual. The boost pressure climbed 60 inches to 65, 70, then 75. The pilot had just gone beyond the standard war emergency power setting. The difference was not mechanical, it was chemical. Inside, the fuel tanks flowed an experimental purple-dyed gasoline known as Grade 150, a fuel so potent it promised to rewrite the laws of aerial performance. As the Mustang climbed through thin winter clouds, the airspeed indicator swept past 420 miles per hour, then 430, 440, and still rising. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang was accelerating through 448 miles per hour. The voice came over the radio, steady but disbelieving, 448, holding steady. The control room fell silent. They all understood what had just happened. An aircraft powered by a piston engine had reached a realm once thought impossible. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a revolution born not from new metal or design, but from chemistry. From a fuel that could make existing fighters perform at levels the Luftwaffe could neither match nor comprehend. Over the grey Ohio sky, the Allies had just discovered their hidden weapon, a liquid catalyst that would soon turn the air war over Europe in their favor. The story of Grade 150 didn't begin in wartime skies. It began years earlier, in laboratories filled with glass tubes, boiling flasks, and the faint scent of hydrocarbons. Long before a single bomb fell on Europe, a quiet revolution in fuel chemistry was already underway. Petroleum engineers understood one principle that would eventually decide the outcome of air combat: octane rating. Octane was more than just a number. It measured how much an air-fuel mixture could be compressed before it exploded on its own, before detonation destroyed an engine. The higher the octane, the higher the compression a piston could handle. Higher compression meant more power. More power meant higher speed, steeper climbs, and greater range. The science was simple. The challenge was production. In 1940, while war raged in Europe, American aviation fuel averaged around 87 octane fine for trainers and civilian aircraft, but far too weak for the new generation of fighters. The British, desperate to match the Luftwaffe's power, turned to American refineries for help. Together they developed 100-octane fuel, just in time for the Battle of Britain. The results were immediate and dramatic. Spitfires and Hurricanes that had once struggled to keep pace with German Messerschmitts suddenly leapt ahead. Their top speeds climbed by 30 to 40 miles per hour, and their climb rates improved by as much as 1,000 feet per minute. In 1940, those numbers meant survival. Pilots who once flew on equal terms now outperformed their enemies. Behind this breakthrough stood a man who understood fuel as a strategic asset: General James Doolittle. Before he became a wartime commander, Doolittle had been an aviation pioneer, earning a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT and becoming one of the loudest advocates for high-octane fuel research. In the 1930s, he urged both oil companies and the US military to invest in advanced refining methods. When war came, that groundwork was ready to ignite. By 1943, 17 Allied refineries were producing high-octane aviation gasoline using the catalytic cracking process, perfected by French engineer Eugène Houdry, who had fled to America just before the war. His invention turned crude oil into high-octane fuel efficiently and in massive quantities, the kind of scale industrial war demanded. The Allies now had 130-grade fuel, the backbone of every major air campaign through 1943. It powered the Merlin engines of Spitfires and Mustangs, the Allisons of P-38 Lightnings, and the mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radials of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Across the Atlantic, the German chemical industry faced a different reality. With oil fields scarce and the Allies bombing supply lines, the Third Reich relied on synthetic fuel derived from coal. The process was slow, expensive, and fragile. Even at peak efficiency, Germany could produce only a fraction of the octane-rich gasoline that poured out of Allied refineries each month. By the time the Allies had reached 130-grade production, German fighters were still running on B4 fuel, rated at just 91 octane, or in rare cases, C3 fuel, which barely approached Allied standards. That gap, invisible to the naked eye, measured only by instruments and chemistry, would soon shape the fate of the skies. The race for superior fuel was no longer about convenience or commerce. It was about survival. And by 1943, the Allies were ahead, but they wanted more. What if they could create a fuel so powerful that even existing aircraft could leap beyond their design limits? That question would lead to an experiment that would change the course of air warfare forever. By 1943, the war in the air had become more than a contest of machines. It was a war of chemistry, fought not only in the skies over Europe, but in the refineries of America and the laboratories of Britain. On one side stood the Allies, powered by industrial abundance. On the other hand, the Axis, driven by synthetic desperation. In the United States, the catalytic cracking process that Eugène Houdry had perfected now turned crude oil into aviation gasoline with unprecedented efficiency. 17 refineries worked around the clock, pouring out millions of gallons of high-octane fuel every month. The logistics were staggering. Pipelines, tankers, refueling depots, all synchronized to feed a global war machine. The Allied 130-grade fuel was the standard. With a performance number of 130 on the rich mixture scale, it became the lifeblood of every major air operation. It filled the tanks of P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, P-38 Lightnings, and P-47 Thunderbolts, fueling dogfights over France, escort missions to Germany, and bomber raids deep into the Reich. The chemistry of this fuel was complex, a blend of hydrocarbons tuned for power and stability under pressure. Across the front lines, Germany's fuel story told a very different tale. The Luftwaffe relied heavily on synthetic gasoline made from coal using the Bergius process. Technically impressive, it was slow, costly, and dangerously inefficient. German engineers could convert coal into aviation fuel, but only at a fraction of the volume that Allied refineries could produce naturally. Worse, the quality lagged far behind. Most German fighters flew with B4 fuel, rated at 91 octane on the lean mixture scale. Their best fuel, C3, used primarily in BMW 801-powered Focke-Wulf 190s and select Messerschmitt Bf-109 variants, approached the performance of Allied 130-grade gasoline, but only barely. And in small quantities, by 1944, perhaps two-thirds of German aviation production was devoted to C3, but it still represented only a shadow of Allied output. This imbalance went beyond chemistry. It was a reflection of industrial might. The Allies had entire continents producing crude oil and refining it into advanced aviation fuel. Germany had coal and a shrinking number of factories under constant bombardment. When the Allies targeted the Leuna synthetic fuel plant and others like it in 1944, they weren't just attacking industry, they were attacking the Luftwaffe's bloodstream. Fuel became destiny. German pilots might match their American counterparts in courage and skill, but their engines simply couldn't. The difference was invisible, yet decisive. Each drop of Allied 130-grade gasoline carried the promise of more power, more altitude, more range. And soon, with the birth of grade 150, even more speed, while German refineries strained to maintain 100-octane equivalents, Allied chemists were preparing to unleash a fuel with a performance number of 150, a chemical leap so great it would make every Luftwaffe assumption about American aircraft obsolete. The era of parity was over. The age of the purple fuel was about to begin. By early 1943, Allied fuel scientists in Britain and America were chasing an audacious goal: to create a gasoline so powerful that it could push existing engines far beyond their design limits. The dream was to find a blend that wouldn't detonate, even under crushing pressures inside the combustion chamber. They called it grade 150, though the number itself was deceptive. Chemically, no fuel could truly have an octane rating above 100, but this new mixture could perform like 150% stronger than pure iso-octane. The secret lay in chemistry. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough and researchers at Wright Field in Ohio experimented with new blends of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene, fortified with a heavy dose of tetraethyl lead, the anti-knock compound that prevented uncontrolled detonation. Each sample was tested under simulated flight conditions, temperature, pressure, and altitude until they discovered the perfect balance between stability and explosive energy. On paper, the results were astounding. Grade 150 fuel had a lean mixture octane rating of 100, but on the rich mixture scale, it achieved a performance number of 150. In simple terms, it could withstand 50% more compression than pure iso-octane without detonating. That meant pilots could increase manifold pressure to unprecedented levels, squeezing more air and fuel into the cylinders, producing enormous power without destroying the engine. By late 1943, experimental batches were being tested at Wright Field. Technicians dyed the fuel purple to prevent accidental mixing with standard grades. When poured into a Packard-built Merlin V1650, the results exceeded every expectation. On standard 130 grade fuel, the engine produced about 1,490 horsepower at military power settings. With grade 150, at 75 inches of mercury boost, it climbed to 1,720 horsepower, the same Mustang, the same engine, the same pilot, but now with the power of an aircraft reborn. Flight tests confirmed it. At altitude, the P-51's top speed increased by 25 to 30 miles per hour, and its climb rate improved by several hundred feet per minute. For pilots, the difference was immediate and unmistakable. They could accelerate faster, sustain tighter turns, and escape from danger with ease, all without a single modification to the aircraft. The revolution flowed directly from the fuel lines. By early 1944, the decision was made. The new fuel would be introduced to operational squadrons. It wasn't without risk. Tetraethyl lead was toxic and corrosive, fouling spark plugs and leaving metallic deposits inside the cylinders. But the advantages were undeniable. As one engineer later wrote, "If maintenance could be managed, this fuel could win the air war." At Wright Field, after the first official test flight of a Mustang running at 75 inches of boost, one engineer looked at the data recorder and said quietly, "Gentlemen, the ceiling just moved." He was right. The ceiling of performance, of engineering, of aerial supremacy, all had been lifted. And what made it possible wasn't a new design or a secret weapon. It was chemistry purple, potent, and about to change the skies over Europe forever. In early 1944, the experiments ended and the deployment began. Allied planners had decided the time had come to take grade 150 out of the laboratory and into the war. The first shipments crossed the Atlantic under tight secrecy. Each drum was marked with bold purple stenciling to prevent confusion with standard fuel. The destination: England, where the 8th Air Force was waging its desperate daylight campaign against Germany. Losses were high. German interceptors still tore into American bomber formations, and the long-range P-51 escort was the only shield keeping the bombers alive. The Mustang's speed and range were formidable, but planners wanted something more, an edge the Luftwaffe couldn't anticipate. Grade 150 promised exactly that. The new fuel was first issued to selected fighter groups for testing under combat conditions. Maintenance crews were briefed on new safety protocols. Groundmen wore gloves and masks to handle the toxic lead-rich gasoline. Spark plug fouling was expected, so replacements were stocked in crates beside the runways. Pilots attended emergency briefings where instructors wrote new figures on blackboards. 75 inches of manifold pressure, a number that made veterans whistle in disbelief. By May 1944, the first combat flights began, and just weeks later, the Allies launched Operation Overlord. As Mustangs swept over the Normandy beaches that June morning, many of them carried the new purple fuel. In their hands was an unseen advantage: higher power, longer climbs, and speeds that German pilots couldn't match. Then came the V-1 campaign. When Hitler's pilotless buzz bombs began raining toward London, interception required speeds near 400 miles per hour at low altitude, almost unreachable for most fighters. Spitfire 14s and Hawker Tempests could barely catch them. Mustangs on standard fuel were too slow, but Mustangs burning grade 150 could accelerate past 420 miles per hour near sea level. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron destroyed a V-1 by tipping its wing with his own. A delicate maneuver demanding speed, precision, and nerve. That feat became a model for dozens of similar victories in the months that followed. By summer's end, Luftwaffe pilots began filing baffled reports. They spoke of American fighters that seemed untouchable, aircraft that climbed like rockets and escaped in level flight. Intelligence officers dismissed these claims as stress or exaggeration. But one German ace, Gerhard Schroeder, often misreported simply as "R" in post-war interviews, later recalled his shock. Having fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, he said the late-war Mustangs had power that made the air itself seem thinner. One encounter captured this transformation. On August 6, 1944, Lieutenant Hollis "Bud" Merlin of the 357th Fighter Group engaged a Bf-109 flown by Günther Schack over Eastern Europe during Operation Frantic. Merlin's P-51D, Hell's Bells, was running on grade 150. His closing speed was astonishing. Within seconds, he had riddled Schack's radiator, forcing the German to crash land behind his own lines. 4 decades later, when the two men met again, Schack admitted he had never understood how the American had closed on him so fast. For pilots like Merlin, the new fuel demanded discipline. It provided tremendous power but consumed fuel rapidly. On long-range escort missions to Berlin, throttle management became an art form, conserving every drop until combat required, unleashing the full 75-inch boost. Engine wear increased, spark plugs fouled faster, overhaul intervals shortened, but no one complained. The trade-off was survival. Mission reports showed the change in hard numbers: higher victory ratios, fewer losses, and German formations breaking apart before contact. The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages, training cutbacks, and relentless bombing, now faced opponents that were faster in every regime of flight. The battle for air superiority had shifted not with a new airplane, but with a new heartbeat in its veins. Every time a Mustang pilot shoved his throttle past the red line and heard the engine surge with unnatural strength, he was flying on the chemistry of victory. The laboratory had reached the battlefield, and the results were devastating. In early 1944, the experiments ended and the deployment began. Allied planners had decided the time had come to take Grade 150 out of the laboratory and into the war. The first shipments crossed the Atlantic under tight secrecy. Each drum was marked with bold purple stenciling to prevent confusion with standard fuel. The destination: England, where the 8th Air Force was waging its desperate daylight campaign against Germany. Losses were high. German interceptors still tore into American bomber formations, and the long-range P-51 escort was the only shield keeping the bombers alive. The Mustang's speed and range were formidable, but planners wanted something more, an edge the Luftwaffe couldn't anticipate. Grade 150 promised exactly that. The new fuel was first issued to selected fighter groups for testing under combat conditions. Maintenance crews were briefed on new safety protocols. Groundmen wore gloves and masks to handle the toxic lead-rich gasoline. Spark plug fouling was expected, so replacements were stocked in crates beside the runways. Pilots attended emergency briefings where instructors wrote new figures on blackboards. 75 inches of manifold pressure, a number that made veterans whistle in disbelief. By May 1944, the first combat flights began, and just weeks later, the Allies launched Operation Overlord. As Mustangs swept over the Normandy beaches that June morning, many of them carried the new purple fuel. In their hands was an unseen advantage: higher power, longer climbs, and speeds that German pilots couldn't match. Then came the V1 campaign. When Hitler's pilotless buzz bombs began raining toward London, interception required speeds near 400 miles per hour at low altitude, almost unreachable for most fighters. Spitfire 14s and Hawker Tempests could barely catch them. Mustangs on standard fuel were too slow, but Mustangs burning Grade 150 could accelerate past 420 miles per hour near sea level. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron destroyed a V-1 by tipping its wing with his own. A delicate maneuver demanding speed, precision, and nerve. That feat became a model for dozens of similar victories in the months that followed. By summer's end, Luftwaffe pilots began filing baffled reports. They spoke of American fighters that seemed untouchable, aircraft that climbed like rockets and escaped in level flight. Intelligence officers dismissed these claims as stress or exaggeration. But one German ace, Gerhard Schroeder, often misreported simply as "R" in post-war interviews, later recalled his shock. Having fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, he said the late-war Mustangs had power that made the air itself seem thinner. One encounter captured this transformation. On August 6, 1944, Lieutenant Hollis "Bud" Merlin of the 357th Fighter Group engaged a Bf-109 flown by Günther Schack over Eastern Europe during Operation Frantic. Merlin's P-51D, Hell's Bells, was running on Grade 150. His closing speed was astonishing. Within seconds, he had riddled Schack's radiator, forcing the German to crash land behind his own lines. 4 decades later, when the two men met again, Schack admitted he had never understood how the American had closed on him so fast. For pilots like Merlin, the new fuel demanded discipline. It provided tremendous power but consumed fuel rapidly. On long-range escort missions to Berlin, throttle management became an art form, conserving every drop until combat required, unleashing the full 75-inch boost. Engine wear increased, spark plugs fouled faster, overhaul intervals shortened, but no one complained. The trade-off was survival. By late 1944, squadron after squadron converted to the purple fuel. Mission reports showed the change in hard numbers. Higher victory ratios, fewer losses, and German formations breaking apart before contact. The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages, training cutbacks, and relentless bombing, now faced opponents that were faster in every regime of flight. The battle for air superiority had shifted not with a new airplane, but with a new heartbeat in its veins. Every time a Mustang pilot shoved his throttle past the red line and heard the engine surge with unnatural strength, he was flying on the chemistry of victory. The laboratory had reached the battlefield, and the results were devastating. Behind every Mustang that roared over Europe stood an industrial miracle. Grade 150 wasn't just a scientific achievement. It was the product of a supply chain so vast, so complex, and so efficient that no Axis nation could have even imagined it. From the oil fields of Texas to the refineries of Pennsylvania, from the chemical plants of New Jersey to the fuel depots of England, millions of people became part of a single synchronized effort to keep the skies burning with purple fire. Each gallon of grade 150 required more than crude oil. It needed precision chemistry, the careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene, the controlled addition of toxic tetraethyl lead, and rigorous quality control testing to prevent detonation or corrosion. This was chemistry scaled to the size of a nation. Between May 1944 and April 1945, the 8th Air Force alone consumed over 53 million gallons of 150-grade fuel. Across all Allied forces, production likely exceeded 200 million gallons. Each drop was refined, transported, and stored with the same discipline as ammunition. Specialized fuel trucks and containers were painted and labeled distinctly purple to prevent any chance of contamination. Safety was paramount. Tetraethyl lead, the compound that made this fuel possible, was also dangerously poisonous. Ground crews wore gloves and masks. Spills were cleaned immediately. Tanks and lines were flushed with precision. Yet despite its hazards, accidents were rare, a testament to the professionalism of the maintenance crews who handled the most toxic weapon of the air war. The logistical reach of Allied industry was staggering. Refineries operated 24 hours a day under blackout conditions. Tankers crossed submarine-infested waters to deliver fuel to Britain. From there, trains and trucks carried it to airfields across southern England, where it filled the tanks of the very aircraft that would later protect those convoys. It was a closed, self-sustaining loop of industrial strength. Meanwhile, Germany's industrial heart was bleeding. Allied bombers struck the lunar synthetic fuel plants and the hydrogenation facilities that turned coal into gasoline. Production plummeted. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were so low that many squadrons could barely fly. Training programs were slashed. New pilots reached the front with only a handful of flight hours. The contrast was absolute. American pilots could fly daily combat missions. German pilots rationed fuel for survival. But beyond numbers and tonnage lay a deeper truth, the merging of science and manpower. In America, the workforce was a living machine. Women filled refineries and laboratories, mixing compounds and testing samples. Engineers, chemists, and factory hands worked side by side, united by the quiet knowledge that the work they did in a refinery could determine the fate of a pilot thousands of miles away. Fuel had become a weapon, invisible yet decisive. For every Mustang that dived on a German convoy, for every bomber that reached Berlin and returned, there were thousands of unseen hands making it possible. The power of grade 150 was more than chemical. It was the distilled force of Allied industry chemistry, engineering, and human will fused into one unstoppable current. The Germans could match courage, they could match tactics, but they could not match this, the industrial momentum of a world that had learned how to turn oil into victory. By the summer of 1944, the balance of power in Europe's skies had shifted irreversibly. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now fighting on fumes. Its best pilots were exhausted, its factories were crippled, and its fuel reserves were vanishing faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, the Allied air fleets were expanding, powered by the purple-dyed liquid that had become the unseen weapon of victory. Before grade 150 entered combat, American bombers were still taking heavy losses, often 3 to 6% per mission. a rate that drained entire crews month after month. But by the end of 1944, after the new fuel had become standard across the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces, the loss rate fell below 2%. Escort fighters could now reach farther, fly faster, and sustain combat longer. German interceptors that once slashed through bomber formations now found themselves outclimbed, outturned, and outgunned. Reports from the front read like a litany of disbelief. Pilots described chasing down Messerschmitts that tried to flee at full throttle, only to watch the Mustangs close the distance with ease. Focke-Wulf 190s that once relied on diving escapes now found their opponents right behind them. The Luftwaffe's advantage had vanished. Even Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the proud architect of Germany's Air Force, could see it. Standing on a Berlin rooftop in 1944, he looked up and saw the unmistakable silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs circling high above the capital. "When I saw those Mustangs over Berlin," he later said, "I knew the war was lost." The numbers told the same story. Between late 1943 and May 1945, American P-51 units destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, and another 4,000 on the ground. The Luftwaffe's veteran corps, the pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, was being wiped out, and Germany's fuel shortage made replacing them impossible. By the start of 1945, Luftwaffe pilots were lucky to fly one sortie a week. Many units were grounded entirely, their aircraft lined up uselessly on frozen runways. In contrast, Allied fighters flew multiple missions a day. Maintenance was routine, fuel was plentiful, and morale was high. A German pilot who burned too much fuel in combat risked not having enough to return home. An American pilot could use full power whenever he needed it. The psychological effect was devastating. German flyers no longer feared defeat, they expected it. Every mission was a gamble against the inevitable. The air war had become one-sided, almost cruel. When Mustangs appeared in the sky, many German formations simply broke apart. By April 1945, the skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. The few remaining Luftwaffe jets, the revolutionary Me-262s, were fast, but few, crippled by fuel shortages and flown by inexperienced men. Allied fighters patrolled unopposed, their contrails stretching across a silent sky. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the Allied command recorded total air supremacy. It had been achieved through courage, innovation, and production, but also through chemistry. Grade 150 fuel had given Allied pilots something the Luftwaffe could never reclaim: the ability to dictate the terms of every battle. The purple-stained gasoline had turned the air war into an equation the Germans could no longer solve. Every P-51 that screamed over Berlin was not just a fighter, it was a symbol of an industrial empire that had transformed oil into power, chemistry into dominance, and science into victory. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe was no longer a contest, it was a demonstration. The once feared Luftwaffe had vanished from the skies, its airfields bomb-scarred and empty. The last German pilots taxied to the end of their runways with barely enough fuel for a single flight, while above them, American and British fighters roamed at will. The difference between those two worlds could be traced to a single chemical triumph: a liquid weapon born of science, refined through industry, and delivered with relentless precision. Grade 150 aviation fuel. Its creation proved that victory in modern war depended not only on courage in the cockpit, but on the minds in the laboratories and the hands in the factories. Chemists who had never seen combat gave pilots the ability to fly faster, climb higher, and fight longer. Refinery workers who never left home produced the lifeblood of Allied power. Every drop of the purple-dyed gasoline carried within it the collective effort of a continent united by purpose. Speed mattered not just for winning dogfights, but for controlling history itself. A faster fighter could choose when to engage and when to escape. A faster nation could choose when the war would end. The P-51 Mustang, powered by 150-grade fuel, embodied that truth. It was not merely an aircraft, it was a symbol of what happens when science and industry move in perfect harmony. German planners had imagined that air combat would be determined by design, by engines, by tactics. They never imagined that the true weapon would be chemistry. While their pilots struggled to conserve a few precious gallons of B4 and C3 fuel, Allied tanks overflowed with a blend that defied every expectation. The 448 miles per hour achieved at Wright Field was more than a record, it was the moment the outcome of the air war was sealed. When Allied pilots soared over Berlin in 1945, their engines roared with the sound of human ingenuity. The war had begun as a clash of empires, but it ended as a triumph of engineering, a proof that innovation could decide battles as surely as bullets. The purple flame that burned in those Mustangs marked the end of the Luftwaffe and the dawn of technological supremacy. From the quiet labs where octane numbers were tested to the roaring skies where freedom was won, Grade 150 was more than fuel. It was science turned into speed, chemistry turned into courage, and industry turned into victory. And in the silence that followed the last mission over Europe, the world finally understood: wars are not only fought with weapons, they are also won with the minds that make them possible.